Good afternoon, listeners, for the Lament of Hope podcast and blog. I am here today with Jaime Hampton, who lives in Alaska. And there's a gift to meet her because I came across her blog post and she was talking about health anxiety, which is something that I personally struggle with and has also just been a gift to see believers who are struggling with reality and daily life that happens and how they're working with it with the Lord. Because I think there's a huge discouragement to think personally, there are a lot of friends I know and in our lives that struggle with mental illness and walk away from the Lord. And so it's encouraging to see a believer who is grappling with it and is being real with it, but at the same time, um, can find the Lord in that as a comfort. So, Jaime, can you, just to kind of get started for the audience who don't know you, how did you grow up and like how did you end up in Alaska? Because I mean, it's probably really cold there right now.
It's funny. It's actually not been that cold. We've had kind of a
Oh,
weird little inversion. So we got about, well, I'll give you my background in a minute, but just as an aside, we had like 4 feet of snow in the span of 2 weeks earlier this year. And it's almost like a lot of it is melted because we had this kind of like couple week span of like 35 to 40 degree weather, and it kind of got
oh,
colder again, but it's I don't think there's ever a typical winter here. It's always different. And so, we had a couple of weeks of like zero. I live in Anchorage, so it's a little more temperate than in the interior where it gets to minus 40 on a regular basis in the winter. um but yeah, so it's been an interesting winter. And right now I think it's in the 20s, which that's about typical for kind of an average, like, teens and 20s for the winter. So it's not
yeah, that
really, really
sounds cold
cold
to me.
in Anchorage. Where are you from? Where do you live?
Virginia, so we're in the 50s right now.
Oh, okay. So I was born and raised in Maryland, in Southern Maryland,
Okay.
and went to school at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, Southwest
Mm-hmm.
Virginia, where I met my husband. Um, and so I lived on the East Coast in the same house until I went to college. I actually moved back home for about a year and a half, and after graduation, and then married my husband. We lived in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, and he's a mining engineer. So he's worked for
Okay.
construction companies and mining companies um, throughout our marriage. And it was work that brought us here. He took a job with a construction company that took us to Las Vegas from Virginia. And that was where our first kid was born, our oldest. I have three. I have a 17-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 10-year-old. Two boys at the front end, and then our daughter's the youngest. So yeah, work brought us to Las Vegas and then Tucson and now Anchorage, Alaska. Yeah.
So
Uh,
what do you think has been the most difficult thing living in Alaska? And then what do you like the most about it?
Definitely, hands down, the most difficult thing is isolation from family,
Okay.
because it's with a family of five, it's expensive to travel,
Yeah.
and it's logistically difficult to travel. So we have family on the East Coast. My husband's family's in North Carolina, and my dad and stepmom are in like outside of Las Vegas. So it's not easy to travel. And during COVID, it was kind of claustrophobic because we were facing not being able to drive through Canada if we wanted to go home because of restrictions, and flights being shut down temporarily. So I just had this panic moment of, what if my dad needs me? What if, our families need us for something and we can't make it? So that was tough. That was definitely kind of it's been definitely logistically and financially kind of taxing being up here. But the best things, it's a place that I tell our kids, because our oldest was 6 when we moved here, and the other two don't remember anything else. One was born here, one was like 1. And I tell them, like, this is the bucket list place that people like save up to go
Yeah,
to.
it's
And
true.
it's like, we go camping in the summer and we drive to places and go camping
Hmm.
every, during the summer, places that people spend a lot of money to come and see and do. Don't take that for granted. It's gorgeous here. It's beautiful. Um, it's unique. The summers are amazing. The winters are
Mm.
so special and beautiful. So yeah, we love Alaska. The only thing is proximity to family.
Yeah. Well, I know when I was coming across your blog, I mean, I really enjoyed how transparent and genuine it was. But you mentioned that you didn't grow up with anxiety or struggling with health anxiety until you were later in life. So it's this
No,
more recent development.
it is. And I mean, if I reflect back, I have a vivid memory of I've always loved biology, anatomy, physiology. I was an animal science major in college. I've always loved surgeries and working at vet clinics, and so all of that stuff is fascinating to me. So I would read my dad's medical encyclopedia front to back, just disease after disease. And I would come away thinking I had the thing that I read about, not in a panicky, scared way, but just in a curiosity way, like, I think I might have appendicitis. That was my thing when I was a kid. I was always, if I got a little pain, I'd be like, I think I have appendicitis. And I had this kind of underlying fear of randomly getting appendicitis, and I would look, well, what are the symptoms? So I did have a little bit of that, but it was always in a very detached kind of clinical, uh
Curious
like,
way.
oh, curious kind of
Yeah.
way. And I definitely was very not I was not a worrier when I was a kid. I would tease my mom because she was, and she worried about everything. She worried about me, she worried about our family, she worried about what people thought and if people were
Mm.
mad at her. And I used to tease her all the time, and then I realized I become her in some ways. So yeah, I did not struggle with anxiety as a child or even as a young adult.
So how did the health anxiety start for you?
I remember, so when I had kids, I all of a sudden things changed, and so I would worry for them. I would be afraid
Right.
that, a cough that ended with, a baby throwing up because they coughed a bunch, like if they had reflux or something. I was like, oh, I would Google. I would go to Google. I would check the symptoms, and I'd be like, oh, that could be whooping cough, or, you know, um, it wasn't extreme at that point, but it was definitely, that was when it started, was when the kids were little, worrying about them. And then in turn, worrying about what would happen if something happened to me, what would happen to them. Obviously, I have a very capable husband who would be just fine. But as a mom, I'm like, okay, what would happen? I need to know
Yeah.
um, that I'm going to be okay. So those things kind of started to whittle away, I think, at my sense of security. But a very clear turning point was when our youngest child developed a food allergy. She had an anaphylactic reaction to cashews, and I didn't know what it was. We had been to Costco. She was like 2, and she had tried a few samples at the, just to keep her busy as we were going around in the cart. And by the time we got home, she had vomited in her car seat and had broken out in hives, which
Mm.
constitutes an anaphylactic reaction. She never stopped breathing. She never had problems. She never actually made it to the hospital because the hives went away after I gave her Benadryl. And the person on the phone was like, yeah, you probably should bring her in because technically that's anaphylaxis. But if she has no symptoms right now, there's nothing they can do. Just, keep an eye on her. And
Right.
um, so she eventually got an EpiPen. Eventually, it was diagnosed that it was cashews. And so um, I don't remember. I think it was she before she was diagnosed with the cashew allergy. Somehow she was not. I did not know what it was, and I gave her something that had cashews in it. I thought it was something else, and we were kind of in the diagnostic process. But I had an EpiPen just in case, while they were figuring out what was wrong. And she had another reaction, and it wasn't as bad. It wasn't anaphylactic. It was just hives. And she said itchy tongue. Like, it was just her tongue got itchy. She had a little bit of hives, but she did not have vomiting. It wasn't as severe. And I just remember this sense of dread coming over me. And I gave her the Benadryl, and I knew from previous experience that it could come back. The reaction could flare back up after the Benadryl wore off. So I was looking at a long night ahead of me. And I just remember sitting on the couch. She was asleep next to me. My husband was in the room. And I was like, I had a
Mm,
watch on, like a watch that registered my pulse. And I was like, my heart rate is over 100, and I'm just sitting here.
mm,
And my husband was like, I don't think that's normal, and I said, and I started thinking, and I was like, well, I guess, yeah, I'm anxious. I'm looking at a long night ahead of me. And I didn't think a whole lot of it. But then in a couple of weeks to come, when I found out what her allergy actually was, I remember with her in the cart going through the grocery store and seeing items in the supermarket. And I had this thought, because I saw like cashew trail mix, and then there was a whole kiosk of pistachios where it's like makes it look like these fun little happy pistachios. And they had told me that she was allergic to both cashews and pistachios. So I'm going through, and I just, this thought kind of, I was feeling myself getting like panicky, like I couldn't even focus on what I was supposed to get at the store that day. And I realized that, and I just had this realization, like everything in the store wants to kill my daughter. Like that was the literal thought that went through my head. And I felt panicky, and I'm like, I can't, like, I don't even want to be in this store with her. It was bizarre, because it was just a very strange thought. So
mm,
that was one. And then around the same time, the real turning point, as I started having these little moments of panic and worry, there was one night my husband was out of town, and I had had a pain like in my lower right side, which coincidentally is where your appendix is. But I'd had like a pain in my lower right side, and I had noticed it ever since I was pregnant with my daughter. Looking back, I think it was like maybe a ligament thing, but I don't know what it was. I never really found an answer. But it started getting worse. And as my anxiety kind of flared up, I would like jog on the treadmill or around the block or the neighborhood to try and get some of this anxiety out. And
mm.
that, I think looking back, that made it worse, but I didn't realize it at the time. And all I knew was I'm feeling anxious. This pain is intensifying in my right lower abdomen. And one night my husband was gone, and I was just laying there, and I just started feeling around in my stomach. Like, what is there something in there in my abdomen? Like, and I felt something that wasn't symmetrical. And in my non-medical expertise, I Googled what that might be. And what came up, and this is like midnight, I'm laying in bed alone, kids are asleep, everything's worse at midnight. And I Googled, and among other things, I came across this story. It was a woman's story, and it involved many of the same symptoms that I was experiencing, like
Mm,
almost to a T.
yeah.
And she was diagnosed with basically what ended up being terminal cancer of the colon.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry,
I,
I'm laughing only because it's relatable. Keep going.
yes, and I love that it's relatable, because I was I would, it took me years to tell people this because I'm so embarrassed about it. I'm not
Yeah.
anymore, because I'm like,
Yeah.
I know this is going to help somebody. I don't care what anyone else thinks, because
Yeah.
it sounds ridiculous, but if you know, you know. Like if you know, you know. And
Yeah.
so I attached myself to this story, and it was complete with her having, last words with her best friend that she would take care of her kids. And like, I mean, it was almost like the devil knew exactly what my deepest, darkest fears were. And that story encapsulated all of it. And I was like, I was like, that must be what's going on. And it was irrational. Like, that is not the first thing that I should go to. Number one, I should probably go see a doctor. But the next day I looked back, and I'm like, that's irrational. I shouldn't be going that route. That's ridiculous. But I didn't really go see a doctor. I may have set up an appointment with my primary care doctor. But I didn't, it takes a while to get in. And I did not treat I didn't go logically about steps to kind of uncover what was going on really. I was just more ashamed at my reaction.
Mm.
Um, so I kind of became obsessive about checking, like feeling what was going on in my abdomen. And I was pretty convinced that there was a mass in my abdomen that never went away. I know that there are things in your abdomen that change depending on, the stage of eating and other
Yeah.
things, but I had a mass like thing that felt like it just didn't go away. And I was like, okay, and I just started doing this like flip flop between, you are so silly. This is ridiculous. Everyone is going to laugh at you. I have friends who are literally battling cancer right now, and you
Yeah.
should be ashamed of yourself for just jumping to this conclusion and worrying when you don't know. And then I would flip back to a lot of times at night, a lot of times when I was alone with my thoughts. I'm dying. I am literally dying right now. And so I got to the point where my anxiety just became, I, even when I wasn't convinced that I was dying, my anxiety was just a constant at its worst. Um, I felt in my, it was like in my chest. It just felt like I could feel whatever,
Yeah.
I felt a surge of adrenaline, like just surging, like every 10 seconds or so, I would feel this surge and then it would stop and then a surge. I just had this constant feeling of fight or flight in my chest
Yeah.
constantly. And I tried
Mm.
different strategies, breathing, imaging, all different kinds of things. And but it was just a constant thing to the point where I had to literally act for my kids. I was extra happy. Like if they looked back on that time, they might think I was a blast because I was always laughing and smiling. I was always pretending to be super happy and
Mm.
wanted them not to have to bear any of my pain.
Right.
And so on the outside, I looked great, but on the inside, I was falling apart.
And when did you figure out, like from that point, when you're reaching this breaking point where it's just becoming a daily thing for you, how did you decide to investigate it further to see, okay, is this something that is typical for people to be, is this consumed about it, or how did you go about um, kind of pinpointing the health anxiety part of it?
So I sort of in the back of my mind the whole time knew that a lot of it was anxiety. I had kind of put the pieces together of rapid heart rate, this surge, and of course I was Googling the whole time about symptoms of anxiety. Um, I would say I made an appointment for sure at one point with the doctor, um, with my, but I didn't go through maybe I did go through a primary doctor. I think I might have had to, but basically I said, I want a colonoscopy because I had it in my head that if I could get a colonoscopy to prove that I didn't have colon cancer, that I would be okay and that it would stop this thing that was happening. So I think I always knew that it was anxiety, but I also couldn't stop believing that it might be true, what
Right.
my deepest fears were.
Yeah.
Um, so I would say that, yeah, so that was kind of a point, but it was a very long waiting period before I could get seen for that. It was, I think, over a month because it's a specialist and we're in
It's
Alaska.
not
I
an
think it's probably
emergency.
everywhere,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's not an emergency. And I made sure that they knew it wasn't an emergency so that it could be a routine screening, so that it could be, not diagnostic and hopefully covered by insurance, which in the end it was not, but that's another story. So but I had this, and I even sort of had this deal with God. I was like, God, if I can get this covered as a routine screening, because I did have a family history, my grandfather had colon cancer. If I could get this done as a screening and my insurance will cover it, I will get the colonoscopy. And if not, I'm going to get over this myself. Of course, like I never thought to get help, never even really talked to many people about it.
Mm.
Because I was ashamed. And they initially told me it would be covered. And so I went into it thinking that it would be covered. And so that's how I went about that. But in the meantime, um, I think I knew all along that it was anxiety. I did talk to someone. I remember going to I remembered making an appointment and talking to the doctor, but the
Hmm.
worst of it at that point had been over. Um, so I don't know if I could stop for a take home message. I would say I went way, way, way too long without telling people that I cared about and that cared about me what was going on. I told a couple of people, but I was so embarrassed talking to them because even writing it down, I think I sent like an SOS text to my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. And I just remember reading it and being like, oh my gosh, this is how could I have let them know this they're going to read this and think, oh my gosh, suck it up, come on, people have real problems. So they didn't. They were absolutely so supportive. They both are very strong Christians. They prayed for me. My best friend
Hmm.
and podcast partner, I did tell her, because I tell her just about everything, and she was extremely supportive and the kind
Hmm.
of person that asks good questions.
Right.
Definitely, pointed me to, maybe you should talk to somebody about this and get some like actual help. Um, and I told my husband, who was also very supportive. Um, but I did not, I did, I, it took a long time to do all of these things when by the time I actually had this support structure in place, the worst of this particular episode was kind of coming to a close.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, but I,
Did
I think,
you did you
go
end
ahead.
up, so you waited the month and you ended up having the colonoscopy, you said?
Yes. And so I would say in this particular case, this was definitely the worst span of anxiety that I have experienced to this day was during that time. And I have had others, but this was the worst. And um it was I remember prepping for the colonoscopy
Hmm. Yeah.
and being so joyful. Like nobody wants to prep for a colonoscopy, but I was
Yeah,
like
you're like
on
answers.
cloud nine.
Yeah.
And I remember that night after doing all the prep, and I laid down and did my usual, like feel around in my abdomen, and there was nothing. There was nothing there at all. And I just was like, what? What on earth? And it was like this moment of, and I should back up to say that there were times leading up to this where I would be literally doubled over in pain. I would get these like sharp shooting pains, and if I moved just right, I would just get these debilitating pains where I would kind
Hmm.
of like double over. And at night I'd be sitting on the couch like feeling like I couldn't even breathe, and like it was bizarre. Like I don't know. I had to have manifested a lot of these physical symptoms through my extreme anxiety. So that's another take home is if you are currently suffering with anxiety, it's very possible that some of the symptoms you're experiencing, not always, but and not all of them, because I do think something was originally wrong
Oh yeah.
and yeah, but you can manifest symptoms in your body. Your brain is very powerful. And I definitely did. I thought I thought I would wake up in the morning and my arms would be heavy and I would not be able to like move my arms all that well. I don't even know to this day. I had numbness on the right side of my body, on my right arm and my right leg, like neuropathy, kind of a like tingling, not numbness,
Hmm.
but like a tingling, weird sleeping leg and arm thing. Um, and it was all, none of it was, I don't know what it was. I still don't know what it was, but it was all acutely like it kind of manifested along with my anxiety,
Right.
my anxiety kind of triggered some of it.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, yeah, I hope that answered the question.
So you had the colonoscopy. You said you were prepping for it, and
Yeah,
you had it, and then did the results come back okay, or?
yeah, everything was fine. And I think I knew the night that I was prepping that everything would be okay because the thing that I wanted them to check was not even there. I just had thought there was, and so and the other questions like, well, is it ovarian? Is it because I do remember before the colonoscopy that I did get my doctor I had to have an appointment. And I do remember her feeling around, just like, I don't feel anything on your ovary. Everything seems okay. Sometimes we have pains and we don't know what they are, kind of thing. Um, but there was nothing. So I knew pretty much going into the next day that it was probably going to be okay.
Was that relieving to you hearing that? Or because I know, at least for me, when I have health anxiety, I mean, I do, but if I have something, I'll get it tested and they'll be like, great, this is okay. I have two thoughts. One is that, okay, well, they're just not finding it.
What is it then?
Right. Or um, it's either they're not finding it or I'll have short-term relief and then a new symptom will pop up as something else. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I gotta hype up on this one thing that I'm experiencing and try to figure this out. It doesn't really end. So for you, was like after it finished, were you relieved? Did you feel like, okay, this is all good? And then as new symptoms would come up as life does, because pain comes all the time, um, did you worry about those things as well? Or was that the episode where it was kind of like, oh, okay, that was just all, a really anxious time of my life. And now when you have moments come up where you feel ill or in pain, you don't worry as much about it.
It's like the first thing. So
Okay.
at that moment, at that moment, I had immense relief. I was like, oh my goodness. And I had suspected it, I think in the back of my mind, like I said, I suspected that it was anxiety only. But at that point, I think some of my acute anxiety had started to subside. And when I did the cleanse and realized that I could not feel the thing that I was convinced was my problem, at that moment it was very relieving. I was kind of like, oh my goodness, I think this is fine. And I went and got
Mm,
a clean bill of health. um Left. I still had 4 months residual symptoms. I still had the weird tingling. So I still, like you said, I'm still in the back of my mind. I'm like, well, it wasn't that, but what's going on with my body? So what I did, I mean, I told myself, I said, I didn't know for sure if this was true, but I said, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to tell myself I'm well. And I'm going to tell myself that all of these symptoms, other than whatever that, because I still had a little bit of that kind of
right. Valid
pain.
pain. Hmm.
Yeah. But it wasn't as debilitating. But I said, I'm going to just tell myself that I'm well and see what happens. And um, an aside, though, is at the same time as I was doing these things and telling myself that I was well, I was also like, even during the height of my anxiety, I did read up on, okay, I need to be taking vitamins because my diet hadn't been good. I had been pretty busy and I hadn't been taking care of myself. We live in Alaska. We don't get vitamin D here. And so we need to take it. So I started taking vitamin D and B supplements. I did I like I did keep exercising, but I
Mm,
wasn't jogging, which I think might have been exacerbating my whatever was going on with my
right.
abdominal pain. Um, but I was exercising, I was taking care of myself. Um, and at the same time, I was telling myself that I was well. Um, and I haven't talked about prayer. I mean, that whole journey of prayer was uh crucial to getting through this. Even like I just the fact that I, even in the moments when I was ashamed of my fears, I could go to God and just say, I'm terrified and I have a feeling that this is unfounded fear. I know I'm not supposed to fear. I'm supposed to have this spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. And I would claim the verses and I looked up verses and spoke the verses about fear. But to be very honest, sometimes they didn't work. Sometimes I didn't believe them. And sometimes I actually felt kind of a repulsion to saying them.
Right.
And
Hmm.
um, even in those times, I knew God was there and I pressed into him. Um, I pressed into worship. That I for some reason, I didn't like listening to Christian radio stations during that time. And I've still tried to unpack that because I love Christian radio, but I did not
Mm,
like Christian radio stations while I was in the thick of this for some reason. And it like, it made me feel too deeply. I can't express it.
mm,
But there were a few worship songs that I handpicked that I remember one day when I was just feeling beside myself with worry and
mm,
anxiety and just overwhelmed with this anxious feeling inside. And I remember on our TV, I watched a documentary. I think it was a documentary of like Hillsong United, and I just skipped to the concert part because several of those songs, there were like two or three of those songs that have been that I really love. And I think it was the song Touch the Sky that I was standing there in front of the TV, probably 3 feet away from the television, just looking at worshiping and blasting this. And I think I had one kid at home at the time, maybe two. I
mm,
think I had two kids at home. And so I was just blasting this music,
mm,
holding my hands in the air, just singing this song and just not saying anything to God, just being with God and just feeling healing from God as I was worshiping. And I just remember that moment. It was painful. Like it was painful to worship in some ways because there was a degree of surrender that happened. And I think maybe that might have been why it was so hard for me to listen to some worship songs, because I was holding on. It's like, I don't want this. I don't want this trial, whatever it might be, even if
mm,
it's imagined. I don't want to be in this. But if I surrender fully, I'm accepting that there might be something real on the other side of testing. There might be the something real could be a struggle with anxiety that's not founded on anything physical,
mm,
other than perhaps chemical or hormonal imbalance. But whatever it is, it was hard to surrender. But in that moment, I remember surrendering and just being like, you're all that matters, Lord. And when I did that, it hurt, but I felt healing. And that moment was a turning point for me. I remember that worship. It was like something shifted.
mm,
Um, so that was kind of the picture of what. And another thing that I did just pray with my best friend, Alana, and I prayed with my husband. And I just asked him, I said, I don't know how all this works, in the spiritual realm, but take authority over me. Will you please pray? Just take authority over me and pray that this anxiety would be gone. Um, and again, there wasn't anything immediate or magical or spiritual that happened in those moments necessarily. I did feel a sense of peace when my husband prayed, when my friend prayed.
yeah.
Um,
Mm,
and but I would never want anyone to think that that's the end game, because I'll be honest, like you said, this last year I have had probably 5 things in a row that have been like trivial to big ish, that have been like what I refer to as health scares. Someone else might not, but for me it's a health scare because I struggle with health anxiety. And so but it doesn't just it didn't go away. It hasn't ever been as intense as it was at that point. I
mm,
think there are a number of reasons for that for me personally, because in looking back, that was the beginning of, um, not to be TMI, but like hormonal changes in my body. I'm in my late 40s and
right.
I'm definitely changing. I'm in perimenopause, and that was the beginning of some
Mm,
symptoms that led me to believe that absolutely that's the start of it. Um, so some of that might be why it didn't affect me at a younger age, and I'm experiencing it more now. Um, but also, um, I just I think the stakes are higher for me now that I'm getting older, and I'm seeing people in my very close circle struggling with very real sometimes terminal illnesses.
Yeah.
And so I would say now this last year, since that time, which I don't even know how many years ago it was, like 7 years ago now, maybe 6 years ago, I think. This year has been probably the most intense since that year. Not because of one thing, but because of 5 different things. And like you said, what happens is I have a concern. I resolve that concern. Then the next thing pops up. Then I obsess about that. And then that one
Yeah.
gets resolved. And then there's something else that I thought I had resolved and wasn't worried about anymore. But then I start thinking, well, what if? So there have just been a few things that have made this different from that time, though. And number one is I refuse to Google my symptoms. That I've set that for myself, and I every once in a while I will slip up and I will regret it deeply, because it almost always leads to me feeling, getting scared
Yeah,
and
you're gonna
reading
die.
someone's story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What
Um,
it's very interesting because you emphasize worship, and it's interesting because worshiping in the midst of heartache is counterintuitive because we like to worship when things are going well, and we
yeah.
feel worship is like very much about the feeling experience, kind of zoning in and thinking, okay, well, I just feel so worshipful, so I'm going to worship.
Hmm.
Um, but it's almost as if you're saying, okay, well, I was worshiping the Lord, and the worship wasn't about how I felt. It was what was true. That I was worshiping the fact that God is on the throne, God loves
Yes.
me, He's sovereign, and that there's a reason for this, even if I don't understand, and even though I don't like it, and in many ways resist it still, I will still worship because that's what I should do. And then in doing that, you receive the blessing of being able to have a moment of just, okay, the Lord is with me, and just being able to be reassured in that. Now, as you're experiencing health anxiety still, is worship becoming more of a way of combating that when you're experiencing just really bad anxiety?
Yes. Yeah, praise and worship. And the reason is the way I've started to look at it has been transformative for me. I think that, when we get to heaven and we're with God, we're coexisting face to face with God. He wipes every tear from our eyes. We will not have the opportunity that we have here on earth to praise him in difficult times, whether it's when a prayer gets answered in the negative that we asked for, or when we have uncertainty, we don't know how the prayer is going to be answered. Every time I come to these crossroads of going in for the mammogram because, or the ultrasound to double check the lump that they were concerned about, like, before I know, I have these like really focused moments of, God, I want to give you praise right now before I know whether I get what I asked for or not, because I'm never going to have that opportunity after this life. And it's a gift, and it's a privilege to be able to offer up that kind of gratitude and praise to
Mm-hmm.
God when we don't know. It's truly a sacrifice of praise at that point. And I get so much joy from that. I think of it as like like a bomb goes off in the heavenlies that just has fallout, that just blasts Satan and his enemies, I mean, and his minions, far, for as far as the eye could see in the spiritual world, when we do that kind of praise and worship and gratitude. So that's kind of become, when I feel anxious, I'm like, God, I hate being anxious. I'd way rather be melancholy and sad, because I can do that. I can wallow, and that feels comfortable for me sometimes, even though I know it's not good. But with anxiety, I can't stand it. And um, but I'm thankful, God, that this anxiety is causing me to turn to you. That this weakness, it's Paul. I asked 3 times for God to remove this thorn in my side, this thorn in my flesh.
Yeah.
But he said, no, he said, my grace is sufficient for you because my power is made perfect in weakness. And
Mm.
so Paul's like, yeah, I'll boast all the more gladly in weaknesses so Christ's power can rest in me. And so to be able to do that in the midst of the tough stuff is a gift. But I've been at times in places where that doesn't come, where, there's mid-level anxiety that I can do that. But the highest levels of anxiety, I do get to the point where I'm just like, okay, I don't even know what to pray. And I sit
Right.
there and I sob, and that's prayer too. And that's valuable, as long as you direct your sobbing or your frustration or your fear or even your anger, that God would allow you to feel this way and not deliver you from it. As long as that's all directed in his direction, there's
Hmm.
healing in that.
Hmm. And
So
I just as a final question for you, because it's just been such an encouraging thing, even for me. Um, how would you encourage someone who is battling maybe with these thoughts and fears for the first time, and so it's coming to them kind of out of the blue, and it's very overwhelming, and they're afraid? What practical as well as spiritual advice would you give to them?
I would just reiterate what I said before. Go to God with whatever you're feeling. And even if that it means there are no words, just sit alone somewhere quietly in his presence and just
Mm,
direct whatever you're feeling to him. And he's there. He's with you. And he will take that and work with it. The Holy Spirit intercedes with groans too deep for words. Like, I believe the Holy Spirit translates all of that into, what your
mm,
deepest desires and needs are, even when you can't articulate them. Number two, do not be alone. The enemy works in isolation. Um, we were meant to live in community, and I waited so long that first time. Now I know I need to tell people when I'm struggling. I need to find a couple of people, or even just one, that you can trust, maybe
mm.
someone that gets what you're going through, that might not be like, oh, okay, but
Right.
someone that really understands what you're going through, to share, man, I'm struggling, I'm trying to stay on top of this one, but yeah, I'm struggling. Three, see a physician and look into hormonal imbalances. That was a big one for me. Look into vitamin and mineral deficiencies. That can cause a lot of these symptoms. And it takes a trigger to get you into it, like your child with food allergies or
Mm,
a random lump in your abdomen. But the fallout after that, could be based on a very physical thing that could be fixed.
yeah.
Don't be afraid of medication. Some Christians feel like it's not spiritual to go to a counselor or a psychologist or psychiatrist or to get medication. And that is as damaging as anything to believe that. Don't
Mm,
be afraid to seek out medical help, whether it's in the form of hormonal, vitamin, or medical, medicine that could help you. Um, and then don't Google, just don't.
Well, listeners, you're listening again to Jaime Hampton. She was talking about health anxiety, and I just highly encourage you to um, read her blog. Her blog post. I'll put a link to it in the summary. But also, it's just such a gift to hear good encouragement. An encouraging word goes very far now. So thank you so much, Jaime. I mean, I was blessed, and so thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Danielle. I told you earlier, I get increasingly excited to talk about this, even as kind of embarrassing as it is to just lay yourself bare before
Mm,
the whole world. But so many people have written and just said, I'm struggling with this same thing. Thank you for sharing. So
yeah.
yeah, you are not alone. Whoever's listening, you're not alone.